for our Meet the Team section, we're going to be introduced to Ben, who I'm going to make introduce himself. Ben.
I am Ben Pielstick. I'm a game designer, and we're working on Camelot stuffs.
Yes, we are. So, I guess we'll start with history stuff. Let's start with background and where you worked before, some of the games that you were involved with.
Okay. Immediately before this, I was on Firefall at Red 5 Studios in California. Worked there for about a year doing PvP stuff, basically for that game. And before that, I was at BioWare Austin working on Star Wars The Old Republic and did PvP for them. And before that, I was at Mythic with Mark, who was, of course, doing Warhammer Online.
Yes. So a lot of those are larger studios. How does it feel from going to a much larger team to basically 24 people here?
Yeah, Red 5 was around about 100 people. Star Wars was obviously way more than that. And so this is a much easier environment to work with. You obviously know everybody. When you have a question, you can just go right up and talk to the person because things aren't tightly as scheduled or regimented as they are in a larger environment where structure is much more important in order to keep things running. So it's in a lot of ways it's easier. We've had issues up till very recently not having enough people on things, so stuff has kind of stretched out the schedule. Things we want to get in the game haven't been getting in the game as quickly as we wanted, but now we're getting more people online, and so those are picking up, and everything looks like it's going very well at this point.
So now we've got you here working on Camelot Unchained. What are you working on specifically?
Specifically right now, I'm working on the combat, the general player character attributes, like the stats systems, the ability system, and getting all of those things to coordinate together.
Mark's known to be a colorful and kind of headstrong guy at times. How's that worked for you so far, and what's the interaction like?
It's fine for me. I mean, as a designer in the industry, you kind of get used to that. Like, everyone who is a designer tends to get very opinionated and have very strong things to say about their work or things that they're very passionate about. And so you kind of just can't get intimidated by people being very, very outgoing with the things that they have to say. And Mark's that way. Scott Youngblood, who's the lead designer over at Red 5, he was the same way, a guy who did design all the way back to like tribes and stuff. So the longer you're in the industry, the more regimented those opinions can get, and the more you can draw on that and really have a really hard time being talked out of things that you've built up over the years. So it's not anything new. It can be difficult having some of those conversations, but Mark is very strongly in favor of challenging things. So it's more along the lines of the difficulty being in the opposite direction rather than him being so set in his ways from so many years at this. He's pushes things more in the other way of you need to think more outside the box and like how can you make this more different than you were already making it. So you tend to have to try and be more creative and more outside the box thinking than otherwise.
I think that would foster a lot of growth because on one hand, when you're going to present something, you have to be extremely certain about why you're doing everything and very thoughtful about the way you create it because you're going to have to defend your position with some argument perhaps.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. You have to make sure that you have good justifications for the things that you're doing, and those justifications in this case can't be easily rooted in other examples that are already pre-existing because you're trying to do something new and different and innovative. And so you can't just say, well, we're doing it like this because it was like that in WoW or whatever other game that you're referencing, because there's a lot of the time with what we're doing and how different this game is turning out to be, there's not a lot of outside reference. So you just have to have good logical reasons for things being the way they are, and you have to go as far as just to say, well, I think this would be a good idea, well, let's try it out, because you don't really know for sure. It's just theory until you put it in the game, give it a try, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But you have to give it a try and actually play it to find out.
Yeah. Is that something that's new for you, or are you working with established systems pretty much for SWTOR and some of the others?
So for SWTOR, there is a lot of pre-existing baggage basically for that project. It's not a negative thing per se, but it is that there was a game pre-existing before I stepped into it. The classes were already more or less designed. The game flow was, very heavily established, and a lot of course, the IP based in Star Wars, they're going in a little bit different direction. The Old Republic, not in the canonical newer things, but there was so much already built up there that you had very strict lines that you had to color within as far as how do we make PvP in this game. You've got the two factions already figured out. You have limited contexts where they can get engaged with each other because there's a story outside of the PvP part of the game that has to be, have continuity with the PvP that we were implementing in there. So there was a lot of things that we had to keep in mind when we were trying to add PvP basically to that game that didn't have it at first before I started on it. Versus in this case, the entire game is PvP, and so there aren't any concessions that we have to make to the other part of the game, basically, and so that frees us up to basically do whatever we want and have a lot more freedom to make PvP what it needs to be.
So how does it feel, a step after that, how does it feel to be creating these things right now on this kind of larger scope of PvP? Is it frightening or is it liberating? Probably both. I don't know.
Well, the scope, in this case, the scope is going to be that there is open world PvP. There's not instance PvP. There's not match made, ranked, pre-existing group type encounters. So the type of PvP is different. I don't know that I would say the scope is necessarily different. Certainly the scope of the entire project is much, much smaller because in the case of, these other games, PvP is like a sort of sideshow. It's like there's a game and PvP is just another one of the features on the box. There's raids and there's dungeons and there's quests and there's all of these other things, and those are all parts of the games, and so is PvP. Versus here, PvP is the entire game. Yeah. That's all you really get to do. So PvP is a much bigger part of the game, but the scope of PvP, the things that you will do, you're only really doing one thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a scope problem where, there's so much more that you have to consider. Obviously I have to consider a lot more because I'm part of a very small team, so I have to do a lot more of the things on the fundamental establishment of a combat system. In the first place, I'm not just building onto a combat system that's pre-existing from a game that was already doing other things, but I'm doing a lot of the work on the PvP side of things as well. So I have more things personally that I'm going to be concerned with, but the game overall is still just, it's a PvP game, so there's not a bigger scope of things.
This is a big step for you in terms of influence that you have on the game's design, and how do you feel about that?
Because the stuff that I've done before is not class design, and I've stepped into these things at a later time doing changes to systems. I've done a lot of the PvP related mechanics that got added on top of systems that were pre-existing. That is different from what's happening now, where there is nothing pre-existing, and so I'm doing a lot of things that I haven't had a chance to really do before. I have opinions on how combat fundamentally should work. How should the player move? How should damage be even calculated? What should be the method of targeting, and how can players interact combat-wise with each other? From your own play experiences or from just previous work you've done? I've built up my opinions on how that stuff could work or should work in an ideal circumstance from my experience playing games and working on other games. But in this case, we're trying to not do something that's standard, basically. So it's coloring outside of what I'm used to personally, and I think what most people are used to. It's more an imagining of if we were making a game, and if you had never played a game before, how would you make virtual people fight each other? And since that's a question that we're trying to answer in a way that it hasn't been answered before, it's really getting outside of any kind of analogy to anything that I've played before or worked on before, and more into the realm of stuff that's been off into tabletop games that Mark often references, into like back into the mud history and things where people didn't have to simplify so much into the terms of just like you have a health bar and the other person has a health bar and you push a button and that performs an attack, and it's very distilled down into this model that we're very familiar with now.
Mark has spoken about customization options in the foundational principles. What can you tell us about that, how that factors into your work, essentially?
As far as just cosmetic customization options for player characters?
I think sometimes there are, not concerns, but some people want to know, I guess, perhaps the reasons why you may be focusing on certain areas rather than on customization options, or maybe you are focusing on that.
Oh, why customization options are a lower priority for us than they are in typical games?
Yes.
Okay, so this being a PvP-focused game isn't just a question of like PvE versus PvP focus. It's PvP focus over basically everything else. So like gameplay matters. Mark often says choices matter, and so this isn't a game about really becoming your character, making it look exactly the way you want to, outside of the gameplay ramifications of that. So in terms of our character customization, the character customization is customization of the character in terms of gameplay, in terms of how they're going to be experienced by the person at the keyboard when they're playing the game in the world. So the player character customizations are things that for the most part are going to matter to that gameplay experience, and not just things that are, I want to have, purely cosmetic things that don't really do anything, but I just like the way it looks, or the way it helps me connect with my character in like abstract role-playing sense. Mm-hmm. And so because we're focused mostly on the PvP experience and the gameplay of PvP, things that actually matter to that experience are more important to us than things that are purely visual and don't really have any impact on any of that.
So it almost seems like you're substituting, if you have an established system already and you need to connect with your character using the visualization aspect of cosmetic choices to put yourself in that game, but instead of just having those pre-existing kind of gameplay, you're creating something new that is going to help you connect with that character through gameplay, which is entirely different, but you're still connecting with that character.
Yeah, the connection to your character should really, in our case, is really targeted to be more along the lines of customizing your experience of the gameplay, of either the non-combat gameplay of like how you do the crafting system and the building system and all of those things, or on the combat side, the combat gameplay and how your character is different from other characters and how the customization choices you make allow you to execute your desired playstyle better than you would have otherwise had you not had the freedom to make those choices. And it also has to do with the limited possibility space of visually differentiating characters from each other. Because if we made a lot of purely cosmetic choices that were just, it makes me look different but it doesn't really do anything, then the what you see is what you get of the interface of the game, being able to look at someone and see what's going on with them is reduced, because a lot of the differences that we make would in that case have no meaning and be purely cosmetic. And so if we take those cosmetic things and we make them actually meaningful things, it means that when you look at someone, the things that you see actually matter in some way, and so that increases the depth of things that we can do that actually make the gameplay differentiation more significant.
Do you think that players will find in the future that they're going to end up looking for ideal stats using builds that end up being very similar, or is that unique aspect of gameplay and the way you can customize things going to continue beyond, and most people would hit a cap? In this case, we don't have such a thing. How does this unique factor continue on as you end up getting more and more powerful as a character?
Well, anytime you have a free-form building system such as ours, you always end up with a few sort of template builds that people gravitate towards. You see this in basically any skill-based game. In non-skill-based games, you tend to have that more formalized, where there's like a predefined build or a predefined class that doesn't have a lot of flexibility options, where it's just, I play a warrior, this is what warriors do, all warriors are basically the same. In a freeform game, it's like I make a character, my character is really good, I post it on the internet, other people follow along with my template, people, refine it, and it aggregately over the internet gets formalized into this build, and then that's a build that people follow because it's very popular, and it kind of works out to being sort of the same way. Hopefully we are going to be able to provide enough differentiation, as Mark either has talked about or will talk about, depending on how, when you're viewing this, the ability system allowing customization of every single ability that you have, in addition to allowing you to customize, what abilities you've unlocked and, how you use them, and how the ability activations interrelate with each other, and how especially magic interrelates. Those sort of things will hopefully make it harder to create a ideal template that will last for very long, because if something gets popular enough, then it will be easily identified and easily countered by other things. And so, like, the flavor of the month effect hopefully will be marginalized by the fact that there are such easy counters to things that become too popular and too strong and too overused.
How do you go about creating a class combat system?
Okay, so the combat system is, in this case, not one that we're trying to derive from other combat systems. In a lot of games, you will see, starting with, or even in the current state of the game, you'll see a combat system that is based around combat systems that you see in typical games, because that was the easiest, fastest thing that you can get working. These systems are very, very simple.
You have a sword. You swing the sword.
You have a sword. You have hit points. You push a button. You activate an ability. The sword swings. Other person's health goes down. That's very, very easy, and that's very, very standard. And in typical RPGs, at least, that's just how the game works. In this case, we're trying to do a reimagining of how that sort of thing could work. So we're talking about how to break up the character into different body parts. Of like, well, what happens if you get hit in the head? And is hitting you in the head going to have different effects based on the type of thing that you get hit with? Can you not only use something different, but use something in a different way, targeting even the same body part, like hitting you in the head, with a sword versus...
Blunt versus sharp object, or what kind of differentiation?
Well, like, maybe an example would be like hitting your enemy in the head with a sword, or stabbing them in the face with a sword. You're using the same thing. You're using it differently. You're using it on the same part of their body, basically, but it's causing a different effect. And that's a sort of non-abstracted way to go about accomplishing a lot of the things that are accomplished very abstractly in other games, where you have abilities like blind, where it's just you push the button that says blind and the other person gets the status effect, and the status effect says blind, and that reduces their stats by such things. And if we remove that layer of abstraction, we go back to virtualizing actual people in a fantasy world, we get a less abstracted experience, where you're doing things that make, common sense.
That you have to think to carry out.
Yeah, that basically work the way that you would expect them to, as opposed to using a abstracted system where you have to figure out how to accomplish things through a series of interactions that don't make necessarily like realistic sense, but work in terms of gameplay.
So you're talking about a lot of ideas with this class combat system. How do you get those ideas actually into the game?
So from the very start, the difficulty of getting things into the game is that it's all just theoretical. Like, it's written down in design documents, it's talked about in conversations, and it's done in some like basic mock-ups and things, but it isn't actually implementable in any way, because there's no tools to implement it, because the constraints of those tools have to be designed first. So at this point, we're still nailing down the exacting details of the design for those things that can go into a basically technical design document, which is something I'm writing now for the character system, and then can go into a task list that can go out to programmers who are currently working on things like importing assets and being able to edit the world and other things that come before we were even able to do very much with combat. But at some point, when there is a a lot of that stuff gets cleared out of the way and the art pipeline is finalized, we'll be able to switch them over to working on tasks of actually doing the basic implementation for the tools that will be needed to create the combat experience by editing the basic constraints and possibilities for what combat abilities could do in the game world. So they have to build those tools around the system that we have designed, and then those tools are used by me, by Mark, by whoever is in the design role, to actually build the stuff into the game and try it out and prototype it and iterate on it.
We're in the midst of doing a lot of internal testing right now, and we have some very helpful community members who are participating in that. And there are times where we might want to reveal some of that information. Is there a reason why we can't go into specifics right now?
So a lot of the specifics for things haven't been finalized enough. As I've said, we want to make sure that when we're designing systems, we don't want to just theory craft everything out and say, this is our idea, it's perfect, and this is the way it's going to be, and in next year when we launch the game, this is the experience that you will have, and these are the abilities, and this is the classes and everything, because a lot of that will change. And the more stuff that we announce and say, this is what it is, and this is how it is, the more stuff that we have to keep and can't change without having some promises not kept to our community, basically. So we want to keep things open as much as possible right now, because so much stuff is interdependent and not finalized enough. So as we move forward, more and more things will go into the internal build and eventually the alpha build, and later on beta, and so on and so forth. But until we get to a point where things are in the game and we can try them out and see how they go, we don't want to necessarily get stuck into committing to them and making sure that they'll stay, because a lot of that stuff in this case will probably get ripped out, and we'll try it, people will try it out, say what they think about it. We might iterate it some and change some things here and there, increase the feature set, but if it ends up not working, we're not committed to keeping it, and it might be that something that we put in just doesn't work, and eventually we have to take it out and put in something different in its place to make the game work the way we want it to.
We've talked about a lot of differences that the game has so far. What are other things that would be different about this game as far as progression?
As far as progression, so in like a typical MMO, you have just a single progression element, more or less, that advances your character, and once you're done with that, you switch over into gear. So you'll have your experience progression from level 1 to level 50, where it's just I gain experience, the bar fills up,
Ding.
I ding, right, and then I get better. Like there's a certain increase that happens across my entire character, that a level 2 character is just better than a level 1 character. And then you also have the side progression of your items or your gear score, and that's independent of XP, but also continues on after it as well. We are not doing that for several reasons. One of which is the reason that I talked about before, which is just that we're trying to reimagine the concept of virtualizing people into a video game and not necessarily having the same type of abstracted approach where, I have strength on my breastplate. Like, what sense does that really make, right? Like, how does it make you stronger having a breastplate? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we're taking out some of the abstractions there and putting in things that are more appropriate to what you see is what you get, what you experience, what you would expect realistically to have happen. And so a lot of that changes the way that like the item progression works. The experience progression kind of the same way, of like you don't necessarily walk around doing things and then somehow just become better as a person because of
I've evolved.
Your experience. Yeah, that doesn't really work, right? And so turning that into a more statistic-based system where you have, you get stronger by doing things that make you stronger, because that's how strength works.
So very specific areas that...
Yeah, more specific areas. If you want your character to become more agile, you have to do things that require agility, and then that's practicing in that, and that makes you better at it. And then that makes it also not a single metric of progression, so the characters kind of spread out and progress in different ways. So, someone who wants to be really strong probably isn't going to be really agile unless they're both really agile and really strong, because they're doing both of those things. But then they're probably not going to have very good like veil attunement that allows them to channel the power of magic through the veil, and because if you're trying to do too many things, you're not going to do any of them very well. And so that type of broadening and I don't want to say completely horizontal progression, because it's obviously you are getting better at things than where you were when you started, but some things will go down and other things will go up, meaning that you kind of stay along a narrower band of power than you would in a game where you were just gaining levels
All
from
skills
1 to
at the same
50.
time.
Yeah, where a level 1 character, a level 50 character, level 50 character is just ridiculously good compared to the level 1 character. Being able to have this broadening wider system is more horizontal than that by far, allowing us to have a system in which all characters from the day 1 character to the day 360 character can play together and not have this huge gap between them where one just like squishes the other with one attack.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of I guess that would be an example from real life as well. I mean, you can tell, I tell people sometimes in martial arts, a white belt who knows 3 moves extremely well can still beat a black belt with those moves if the black belt doesn't use those moves as much. So it's kind of like, in the game, if you're doing one thing and you're progressing with that one thing, working really hard at that one thing, you can still beat somebody who might be at a much higher level than you.
Yeah, or at least in this case that you can certainly participate. You won't have as many moves, as you said, you won't have as many abilities. It is very similar to that. But the things that you have, you are still proficient at, and that you will still be able to utilize effectively, especially in the context of group versus group encounters, because this is not a solo game. This is a game where you are going to want to have friends around. There will be opportunities to, have characters that want to get into 1v1 situations, but for the most part, most characters are going to want to be in some way involved in combat involving lots and lots of other characters. So being able to join in with that right away and still be able to contribute, not just be a tag-along useless guy who just shows up.
Just goes for the experience.
Yeah, just shows up to get the progression rewards and hopefully at some point later will become good. No, being able to walk into this game day 1 and be able to do something useful is really important. And that'll hopefully hook players and allow them to jump right in and with their friends and with the other members of the community helping them out, get right on board and immediately track into the gameplay experience that we want to deliver to them.
You've talked about stats and things of that nature. How will you know when to perform an action if you're not seeing your usual running numbers that you do in many MMOs? Why remove those numbers?
A lot of the removal of the abstraction from this game has to do with making the game more subtle and requiring a higher degree of attention in order to assess situations and achieve optimal performance for your character. So, for example, if you see a guy and you notice that he's limping a little bit, that's way different than the case where you see a character and that character has an icon and that icon says snare minus 50%. And so that again goes back to the way we were talking about making the combat more realistic, making the progression more real world, and creating a game that's not as abstract and as gamified as some of the other typical modern MMOs are.
Do you think this is going to make the game more difficult or just change the way that you interact with games that you haven't before?
I definitely think it is more difficult. There's, as Mark likes to say, less hand-holding, and hand-holding is kind of an idea of simplification, really, at its core. The idea that if you spoon-feed people things, they will get them and they will understand. And if you make things as clear and obvious as possible, that will make sure that people receive the information that you are trying to convey and are able to use it to, win the game or beat the game or at least perform well in the game. Removing a lot of that and making the game more, I don't want to say intentionally more difficult to understand, but more subtle and requiring paying more close attention to more subtle cues is a way that we can make a game that's targeted more at hardcore players and at experienced players, as opposed to a game that's targeted at new players who are stepping into something that they've never even tried before, where this is like their first game. They need a lot of extra information and reminders and pop-ups and things to try and hook them into understanding that they're playing a video game. If you've played hundreds and hundreds of hours of dozens of games, you kind of get that already. You skip the tutorials on everything, you look everything up on YouTube and wikis and stuff, and you get it, right? And so having to pay a little more attention, having to look at things a little bit differently, and having to rely on support from other players in order to get information on things that you would normally have had access to by default in other environments is something that we think that our target audience will be able to handle and will appreciate more than if we were making a more simple game that just gave them all of the things that they're used to having for free in other games.
Isn't that strange that we've been trained to see video games as something that is almost a graphic quality rather than reflecting the things that actually happen in real life, that we've trained people to not pay attention to social cues and physical attributes and look for a graphic icon?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you listen to some of the things like Richard Bartle says about, MUD and the old days of early PC gaming, or original gaming, or even going back further than that, like Mark likes to like D&D and stuff, those games were a very early attempt at taking reality, putting it into virtual reality, and then adding in a layer of fantasy to it, where there's real things, swinging a sword, and unreal things, throwing fireballs, and how do you make that work in a way that approximates what it would be if it was reality? And as things have gone on, and as time has gone on, and we've tried to mass market things and create games that your grandmother could play, as was a mantra at EA, we really wanted to broaden that appeal and get more people in, and by making things simpler and easier to understand and easier to access, that makes it accessible and playable and enjoyable for more people. But it's not as enjoyable for the people who are really, really into it, because they're having all this simplified stuff thrown at them that they don't really need. Like, they get it already. They don't need to have a tutorial. They don't need to be handheld. They want to have a deeper, more engaging experience. And the experience isn't deeper and more engaging because it has to appeal to everyone. And so a lot of that gets stripped away. And now we're seeing kind of a backlash of that with games like Camelot Unchained, with games like Star Citizen, which are like, no, there are people that miss the depth. There are people that miss these experiences where the games kind of have started out a very long time ago, where they were really, really complicated, they were really difficult, not as many people played them, but for the people who played them, they were really, really fun. And since that doesn't make a lot of money, especially when you have really, really big budgets, that's kind of fallen off lately. And so now we're kind of getting into a possible resurgence of these things, which I think is really good.
And then we'll close.
Yay.
One of the most important questions. What is your favorite color?
Blue. No. Yellow. Is that the correct Camelot answer?
It
that
is.
question?
Thank you, Ben. All right. Well, thank you, Ben. We look forward to hearing more about you in updates this coming week, hopefully.
Yep. Thanks.